So in this video I'm going to give a quick overview of the traumatic history of the Western world, with the United States in particular, with a slightly lesser look at the UK and other colonial Western powers, and how that affects modern day times and psychology. First thing, I should apologise, I'm in shorts. You may occasionally see a hairy leg. I appreciate this is pretty traumatic, but we're just going to deal with it together. Okay, so what we see playing out in the Western world today has many influences, causes, perspectives. One that's often overlooked, however, is trauma. So I work in trauma education. That's one of the fields of work. I've trained in such people as the military of Sierra Leone, aid workers in Afghanistan, the Ukrainian military. I've done peace work here in Israel, where I am now. Major charities like Oxfam and Save Children in the UK. So that's a little bit where I come from. I'm not a therapist. This isn't therapy, but more from an educational point of view. Now, when we look at a country like Israel, Russia, Afghanistan, I'll do other videos in other countries, it's quite clear, you know, recent history of war, genocides, this kind of thing. It's quite clear where we might say, hey, the trauma's affected these people's psychology. Things like hyperarousal, numbing, trauma symptoms, which may exist en masse on a cultural level. And as I said, I'll do other trauma videos on different cultures that I work in coming up. However, I thought let's start at home with Western civilization, particularly focused on the United States, because it's often overlooked. So when we look at the United States, we might say, well, the United States hasn't been invaded in a long time. Yeah. Okay, let's start to look at the history. So the Native Americans, native peoples of America, the destruction and killing and rape of this culture is largely considered one of the biggest, if not the biggest, genocide of human history. Big one, hey? Hard to get numbers because of lack of censuses, you know, what counts as introduction of illnesses count, if that was done deliberately, you know, over what time period, but somewhere between 10 and 100 million. 10 and 100 million, just to give you an idea. Hitler's killing of the Jews, Slavs, homosexuals, other kind of peoples in World War II actually is less numbers. So this is a big number. This is what the country was founded on. It was also founded on immigration, right? So who were these early immigrants? Well, let's look at them. So many of them were pursuing religious persecution. They may have come out of genocides themselves in France and the Netherlands. You know, the original colonists from America may well have been coming from traumatic backgrounds themselves, if not actual genocides, at least living in fear of persecution. So we had traumatized populations coming to a place. Then they were met, of course, with starvation and hardships. You know, a lot of early settlers died, so you know, that was pretty traumatic. And then they went and killed the native people. So this is unequivocally the case. This is a country founded on large amounts of violence. Then the next big one, so that one continues, the next big one we can look at the slave trade. You know, really a slave genocide. So the amount of people who were coming from Africa were killed either in Africa, killed on the ships, because of the conditions, diseases, blah, 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 killed on the plantations, etc. We then had a extremely traumatic group of people, and those traumas still resonate, not just in African American populations. And here's the thing, here's the one that I really want you to get. People who do trauma are also traumatized. Yeah, people who do violence, people who commit atrocious acts are themselves traumatized. Now, not a lot of people know the reason the Nazis invented the gas chambers is not just because they were German and they wanted to be efficient, but was also because the soldiers who were killing the Jews through shooting them or clubbing them on the head, which is how they had killed the first million Jews in places like the Ukraine, something called the genocide, the Holocaust by bullets, were getting so traumatized by shooting all these poor Jewish people that they were actually fucked up in the head. And the Germans said, in order to save the poor German soldiers from getting fucked up in the head, we need another way of doing this that isn't so traumatic for the people doing the killing. Yeah, this is why drone strike operators to this day still get traumatized, which brings us on to our third major one. So we had the Native American genocide, we had slavery, which is itself a genocide, had the Civil War, which was pretty apocalyptic. You know, it was one of the first kind of major, you know, just before World War I, and one of the first kind of industrialized wars, as you will. So a pretty horrific event involving large amounts of the population. Then we've had all the wars since. Yep. So America's currently bombing 7 countries. That's a fact right now. The United States is bombing 7 countries. Also, you know, just the number of wars the United States has been involved in. You can look up the facts. There's far less years the United States has been at peace than it's been at war. Most of South America. Obviously, the big ones like World War I and World War II, you know about, but you know, Vietnam War, Korean War, Iraq War I, Iraq War II, Afghanistan. So ever since the Civil War, America's been basically committing violence abroad Now, it might not be being traumatized at home, but those people have been coming back. So the crazy Nam vet stereotype is, of course, one. And luckily, knowledge of PTSD has kind of grown in recent years. But even the drone strike operators who are, safely in Washington or wherever, killing people in Yemen or wherever, are getting traumatized. So you've got a whole country built on trauma, essentially, from the past to the present. Why is this relevant? Well, because symptoms of trauma, as I've explained in other videos, are massively political. So the us and them, the hard divide of us and them, is a symptom of trauma. You'll see this in Israel, you'll see this in Russia, you'll see this in rural America, many parts of America actually, even like the liberals and the non-liberals. It's us and them, it's black and white thinking. You'll see problems with boundaries, over defending boundaries, the 9/11 reaction, a massive over defense of a boundary, one could call that overreactivity to a perceived threat, thinking the world is a dangerous place. So we saw with 9/11, you had this striking at the heart of America, which hadn't happened in a long time, but this body was reactive, was these hyper-aroused, ready to go, America! That hyper-arousal, stuck in fight or flight adrenal body was there, ready to go already, plus with this sense of us and them overreacting to a boundary, causing these wars to result in deaths of millions as a result of this one terrorist act. So assuming it wasn't a setup, but we're not getting into conspiracy theories. So this hyper-arousal, this USA, the nationalism, the black and white thinking, the issues with boundaries, the numbing, so the lack of empathy that we commonly see expressed by American soldiers is also a result of this. So these trauma symptoms that exist at a cultural level are coming from this long history of trauma and oppression. Hurt people, the oppressed become the oppressors. We see in Israel, and we also see this with the escaping kind of refugees becoming settlers in the United States. That's the very short version, because this is a quick YouTube video. If we look at the other European colonial powers, we can see the same patterns. So, Britain hasn't been invaded in a long time, except for the kind of Blitz, which was relatively traumatic for some, central London, Coventry, places like that. Actually, a relatively untraumatized population. But what we have been doing is having wars abroad. We've been involved with various genocides, like Bengal in the 1940s, Churchill's major genocide, almost as big as Hitler's against the Jews. Not a lot of people know about this one. Various ones in Africa. The Irish potato famine, of course, was a genocide. My own family are Irish, we know all about this. The Brits have been involved in all kinds of genocides, and the colonialism, the genocides of native peoples in places like New Zealand or Australia, where Aborigines were considered actually flora and fauna until something like 1960s, like incredibly recently. You see the amount of violence that's been perpetrated by colonial nations. The Dutch are worse than the British. The French are generally considered worse. The Belgians, definitely one of the worst in Congo. So this is really all of Western Europe. There's only a few non-colonial powers in Western Europe. Portugal, Spain, they're both colonial. Denmark is not colonial. Norway, not really so much. With a few exceptions, all of Western Europe had this colonial history of trauma, and trauma goes down through the generations. As it says in the Bible, the sins of the father will be visited onto the son for 5 generations. So 5 generations, I think. Definitely what we see is trauma kind of going through the generations of cycles of abuse, of addiction, etc., etc., etc. So when we're looking at the Western world, we're looking at a group of people who have traumatized themselves by fucking other people up. Basically, United States primary amongst those because of the nature of slavery, because of the Native American genocide, and just the large number of wars since. It's really, look it up, it's incredible. I think Britain has invaded 8 out of 10 countries, incredible. The United States has been at war for something like 180 of the last 200 years, and it's really ridiculous. 7 countries I mentioned currently being bombed. So when we see people retreating to the security of a certainty of a sort of almost dictator type figure like Trump, when we see the kind of liberals and the conservatives so at each other's throats, when we see that hyper-arousal, that lack of listening that happens in the current political debate, one useful perspective is to see this as the result of trauma, and to realise that trauma healing, which is possible, I won't go into exactly all the methods now, but see in other videos, is definitely part of this. It's one part, it's one perspective. United States as a traumatised culture, and subpopulations in that even more traumatised. Britain, the Western powers of Europe, not far behind in the trauma scales either. So I hope that's an interesting perspective for you. Please add your own points of view in the comments. I'm not an expert in American history by any means, so if I've missed anything major, I'm sure I have, or misunderstood things, then please add that to the video.